One of the really important aspects of this election that students need to understand is just how much voting and voting rights have been politicized with really important consequences for our politics today. So for some time, there's been an increasing partisan divide among Americans and among politicians about their understanding of the relative importance of voting rights versus so-called voter integrity measures. And so for several decades, Democrats have been really concerned about ensuring that people, particularly people from historically disadvantaged groups, have had an equal opportunity to vote. And so they've really been focused on expanding the scope of the Voting Rights Act and pursuing litigation and public policy measures to make it easier for people of color, people with English as a second language, to make it easier for them to be able to access the polls. In contrast, Republicans, particularly over the past 20 years, have increasingly had concerns about what they view as voter integrity issues. In particular, they've claimed, although without evidence, that people who are not eligible to vote have been turning up to vote and thereby potentially affecting election outcomes. It really is important to understand that there is not actual empirical evidence that there is widespread voter fraud or voting by impersonation or anything like that. But this has been a concern, particularly among Republicans, and that probably reflects kind of broader underlying concerns among Republicans and conservative Americans about immigration and changes in the demographics of this country. And so concerns about voter fraud are very much racialized and expressive of anxieties and greater racialized concerns about the changing nature of American society and the changing demographics within American society. And we've really seen this come to the forefront during Donald Trump's presidency. So President Trump, throughout his presidency, has made numerous false and misleading claims about the frequency and scope of voting by people who are not eligible, voting by undocumented immigrants, by people who are otherwise not eligible. Again, it's really important to understand that those sets of claims by the president and his supporters are false. That independent examinations, both by journalists and by social scientists, have not found evidence of widespread voter fraud, but these claims have circulated broadly and have very much affected the 2020 election cycle. So something that is really important this cycle is that due to the pandemic, a huge number of people are voting early. Right? They're voting absentee, they're voting by mail, they're accessing early voting, they're using same-day registration where it's available, and so forth. And as we've seen during this election cycle and coming up to the election, there's been a huge amount of litigation within states, more than 300 lawsuits across the country, fighting over whether and how those votes are going to be counted, because many states have sought to extend vote by mail deadlines and make it easier for people to vote by mail so that they can reduce face-to-face turnout, right, on election day tomorrow, so as to kind of mitigate the risks associated with the pandemic and having lots of people in close proximity for voting. And so there's been really tough contests between Republicans and Democrats in the courts, in state legislatures, about how votes that have been made early, particularly by mail, should be treated and to what extent they should be counted after election day. So we've seen President Trump, for example, argue that in some battleground states that they're not going to count ballots that are returned after election day, even though those ballots, if they're postmarked before election day, are indeed valid and legally must be counted. And those concerns, again, on the part of Republicans are very much tied to these anxieties that conservatives and Republicans have been expressing over the past few decades about what they allege is voter fraud and other forms of illegal ballot manipulation. And so this conflict that we're seeing right now over voting by mail and other forms of voting that are not happening on election day are part of this bigger story about how voter turnout and voting rights have become part of partisan conflict and have become racialized in American society. And the real tragedy of all of this is that for both parties, but unfortunately, particularly for Republicans over the last 2 decades, there's been much less focus on, well, how do we appeal to new voters, and how do we make sure that people who are entering the electorate are getting what they want from our party and might be interested in voting for our party. There's been much less attention to that and more attention to trying to manipulate the rules to reduce turnout among particular groups on the assumption that those groups will not support the party in an election campaign. And so that's the really sad part of this story, is the failure to see the expansion of the electorate as an opportunity and something that's beneficial for democracy, but rather something that is a threat and a danger. And more generally than that, voting and voting rights is and has become a kind of microcosm for our racial politics more generally. That we see too many Americans expressing anxiety about demographic change and behaving in a kind of reactive and reactionary crouch in response to demographic changes, rather than seeing the diversification of our society as a really exciting part of our shared culture and heritage and an opportunity for the growth and expansion of our democracy. We have just released our most recent survey. It's a nationally representative survey of likely voters in the United States, plus an oversample of white working class voters. And the real highlights, I think, although in some ways they're kind of lowlights, are that there's a huge amount of anxiety and concern across the board about the stakes of this election. People are very concerned. A supermajority, upward of 80% of those that we surveyed, are concerned about the possibility of violence during this election cycle. People are taking active steps to try to protect themselves and their loved ones in anticipation of possible dangers from this election cycle. We found that more than a quarter are planning on staying home on election day. 40% plus are planning on staying away from crowded places. Most disturbingly, 16% of the respondents to the survey indicated that they'd purchased a gun in anticipation of possible election violence. 14% said that they had purchased ammunition. And so we view this as really reflective of the high state of concern and alarm among many Americans during this election cycle. Indeed, supermajorities of both Democrats and Republicans said that they would be very angry and very afraid if their preferred candidate lost in this election cycle. And so I think one of the really critical takeaways from the survey is, regardless of the outcome of this particular election, there's a huge amount of work that we all have to do to help repair trust and repair the severe antagonism among Americans. That regardless of party and ideology, this is a country, and we do have to find a way to work together, at least on a minimal level. And the very high level of alarm and concern, which very frankly has been manipulated politically, unfortunately, particularly by President Trump, but has been kind of ratcheted up by politicians in order to try to win votes. But it's not good for our democracy when there's just a high level of anxiety and fear going into an election. So there's been a long-term trend in terms of increasing the accessibility and the convenience of voting, and movement away from voting on election day. So over the past 2 decades, and especially since 2010, states have been implementing a range of measures to make it easier to vote and create greater flexibility for people to vote before election day. So the implementation of early voting, the implementation of no excuse absentee voting. There are states, several states now, that have all vote by mail elections, so you don't even have to go to the polls to vote. And The pandemic has accelerated that trend, and I think in the short run, as a matter of public health and public safety, right, to try to reduce crowding at the polls on election day. But I think what we're going to see, and I think we'll see this more broadly in American culture, is this is going to accelerate the move toward people voting before election day. And there's going to be increasing pressure on public policymakers to provide a wider array of options for people to vote before election day. And frankly, I think that makes a lot of sense. It's increasingly difficult to justify compelling people to or expecting people to vote on a single election day, particularly when that day is a weekday, and many employers do not provide people with opportunities to take off of work in order to vote. And also when in many communities across this country, there is inadequate election day infrastructure, and so people have to wait in long lines in order to vote. And as we saw in 2016, 2012, other presidential election cycles, in some communities, particularly in cities, you can see people waiting for hours to vote. And that's really just not acceptable if we want to have widespread voter participation, and particularly equal opportunity to participate. It's quite likely that a reason, although not the only reason by any means, for there to be both lower turnout than we might otherwise expect, but also racial and class differences in turnout, is a heavy burden on people to wait in line to vote either before they go to work or after they've worked. And so I do see a lot of benefits to extending the voting period, to providing people with a large number of opportunities to vote. And I think that we will increasingly see a huge amount of demand from voters to increase the number of opportunities and also increase the period in which they can vote prior to election day.
All of us, I hope, have learned, not just students, in the last 4 years, is that institutions matter. And that's very boring. And that elections matter. And I think a lot of people don't think that's true. They think, oh, everybody's just the same. And, until something super radical happens that somehow falls in line with every single thing I believe in, elections don't matter. But Donald Trump has very different Supreme Court nominees than Hillary Clinton did. And she would have had a host of other different policies. It's hard to predict exactly how, but you'd have to be an idiot not to think they'd be different. So elections matter. And I think institutions matter. President Trump has assaulted basic norms of government, firing inspectors generals, blatantly lying about elections. Those are just kind of things that were in some ways unimaginable before. And to some extent, he's been pretty successful with it. And you see if that someone is willing to just brazen his or her way through a series of lies, essentially, can get away with it if other institutions don't rise up a little bit, like maybe the Senate occasionally calling the president out on certain things. So the first things I would tell students, and not just students, but everyone, is institutions matter, and so do elections. But maybe on the good news side, President Trump has repoliticized young people. And I mean, I was 12 when the voting age went up from 18 to 21. And so every election since then, someone said, this is going to be the election young people are going to turn out. And it's always been wrong. I mean, some people said under Obama, look, Obama had a big young vote. He enthused young voters. They were the same percentage of the electorate as they were before. And I think a lot of that's just being young. I mean, you don't touch the government as much as you do as you get older. And then as you get older, you vote more. It's just a fact of political life. But I think in this election, my sense is that there is going to be an increased turnout. And I think young people are more comfortable with the newer technology. I hate to say vote by mail is a new technology. It's not. But I think they're more comfortable doing things a little differently. And vote by mail and early voting, or I think young people have probably availed themselves of that at higher percentages than older people have. presidential elections are such an outlier from campaigns, other campaigns. And the reason is everybody knows who's running. And a lot of people, they don't know who's running for Congress, even in a heavy politicized year. So Congress people have to spend a lot of time on campaigns, just getting people to know who they are, whereas presidents don't. And so their campaigns really operate at the margin of turnout. You know, a couple 100,000 people switching their votes in 2016 would have been a different president. So I think that President Trump, who's basically out of money, is probably spending more of his time and his organization's time on voter turnout and the ground. Whereas the Vice President Biden had plenty of money and was heavily on the air in a lot of the target states up until the end. So I haven't seen much new in that sense. The newest thing in this election is how COVID has, and I think President Trump too, to some extent, in his criticisms of the election. I think the combination of those two things have moved a lot of people to mail-in voting, or not, let's just say non-traditional voting. And that could have an impact over the next few days as Republicans try to cast suspicion on those kind of votes if it's close in places like Pennsylvania. I don't know about long term. I think that you're going to see more and more money, and this has been a trend over the last decade, but it's going to be accelerated on directly contacting voters through mail and phone and in person. I believe that the internet is a very useful organizational tool for campaigns, but I think this is just me thinking it. I don't have any research to say it's true. I really think it's becoming less and less of a trusted source. I mean, anybody that believes the stuff they see on Facebook, they're hopeless. There's nothing I can do about that. You know, we need to do a much better job of educating students in how to consume information and how to judge sources. And you have a great job because you're learning a lot of that kind of thing on the ground and doing it, you know, on an everyday basis. But, you know, the notion that somehow the truth is more likely to be resident in some obscure blogger who has no resources to follow up a story, as opposed to, say, the Washington Post, it's not true. So I don't think the internet's going to be much of a trusted source of information, but it's still going to be big when it comes to organizing meetings and fundraising and people. It's probably been harmful to our information environment overall, social media. Yeah, so more money on the ground. Just one more comment. I mean, in the age-old rally, right? People have always done rallies, and they still do. It's amazing to see how there is just a large percentage of the United States, I don't know how big, let's say 40%, who just don't believe COVID is a problem at all, or they believe, in fact, that belief in COVID is the problem, and they'd still go to rallies despite the data that suggests they're, you know, events that actually spread the virus. I think we're not only seeing a candidate, an official, the president, not doing much about a pandemic, but actually abetting it in a way. That's kind of unusual. I would hope a lot of them have already gone into it, and I hope people vote. But I also think that you should really look up, have on hand in writing on a piece of paper somewhere, some county election results from some of the big counties in 2016. I'd say Arizona, Pennsylvania, maybe Ohio and Florida. And then just sort of, when you watch the election results, look at what the county projections are, and then see what they look like vis-a-vis the last time. Because you may see Trump winning a county in Florida 55-42, and you're like, oh my God, he won that county big. But then you look at last time, and he won it by 10 points more. And that'll help keep you sort of a comparative perspective. And I would also maybe look up the laws in some key states, because Florida is already counting their votes. Pennsylvania is not. So little things like that, if you're, let's say, very anti-Trump, for example, you may watch Pennsylvania on election night, and it might look like the president's going to win Pennsylvania, because the people who vote in person are heavily in favor of Trump, but people who voted by mail are even more heavily in favor of Biden. So the actual results in Pennsylvania might not be for 2 days after the election. And there could be a lot of drama in those 2 days. So I would advise not to get too excited or too despairing over those kind of things on election night, unless it's an overwhelming victory one way or the other. For many people, this is very important, and they feel like the world's going to fall apart or change or something after the election. But no matter what happens, we're still going to get up in the morning and do whatever we do. So I think people need to start thinking, how am I going to react to a victory or loss? You know, what's my orientation, my existential orientation to the world going to be? Sort of everything's leading up to this time, but there's a lot of time left after it, especially for you guys. You know, decades of your life left after that. So I think people need to start thinking about, what's my orientation to the political world going to be after this is over.
You know, one thing that's really, really troubling is how many people are concerned about the aftermath of the election, right? We just ran a UMass poll where we found that 80% of people were concerned about election violence, either very concerned or somewhat concerned about the prospect for violence surrounding the election or after the election. A lot of people said that they would be afraid if their candidate loses. A lot of people said that that they would be angry if their candidate loses. So in a lot of ways, what we see is a nation that is consumed by fear and loathing along partisan lines. And that's not a good thing. This partisan division in our country has led us to a point where it produces questioning of our basic democratic principles. And so I don't think we're going to get rid of partisan polarization anytime soon. I think that's a much more natural state of affairs than the sort of non-polarized world that we saw in the middle part of the last century. But we need to figure out a way to lower the temperature. We need to figure out a way for our government to work. You know, the hope, I think, rests in all of us, but especially in our leaders, right? Our leaders speak with more prominent voices when it comes to this sort of thing. I suspect that Donald Trump will lose tomorrow. I suspect that he will lose by enough that it won't come down to just one state or two states. If that's not the case, if he either wins or if it does come down to one or two states, I think we're in for a very, very tumultuous period because, you know, the battle over the presidency, if it sort of lingers on and it's not a decisive win for one candidate or the other, will be an ugly one, I think, and it will leave a lot of scars that on a body politic that already has a lot of scars, frankly. And I do think that as I said, I think it's likely that Trump will lose. And I think that leaders need to really be held to assessing the way that things have gone under Trump with the language that Trump has used. And by the way, polarization is not, you know, new. In a lot of ways, Trump is the product of it, not so much the cause of it. But he has his willingness to just sort of say anything that he thought benefited him in the particular moment has raised the temperature a lot, and it's made certain things acceptable to say or seemingly acceptable to say that weren't before, including things like dehumanizing language and questioning basic democratic principles and democratic norms, and elected officials, you know, doing things like lowering citizen confidence in the machinery of government and the machinery of elections. All of these things are things that I think politicians, even if they believe in the moment that it benefits them in some narrow political way need to be able to pause and step away from. Donald Trump has not done that. And I think it's been to the detriment of our country. So my hope going forward is that political leaders will look at Trump and hopefully be looking at a decisive defeat for Trump, and seeing that as a clear signal that we need to return to some of the norms that we've had in the past. And I think a return of that sort will help us lower the temperature. I actually think polarization in general, and the kind of polarization that we are currently seeing, it is normal in the following sense. So there was a long stretch during the last century when to be a Democrat or to be a Republican didn't necessarily mean you were a liberal or a conservative, respectively. It wasn't aligned with your education level the way it is now. It wasn't aligned with your worldview the way it is now. It wasn't aligned as much with where you lived and who you were the way that it is now. And so partisanship, because all of those things have become aligned, has become this sort of superordinate, powerful identity. And when you have an identity like that, human nature really has us turn the world into an us or them kind of landscape. And when that happens, things happen like stereotyping and scapegoating. You don't trust the other side. And when you don't trust the other side, you demonize the other side. And when you demonize the other side, you have a hard time working with the other side. You have a hard time letting the other side win. You have a hard time believing that the other side's victories are legitimate, that their motivations are anything but nefarious, right? And so this polarization that has emerged, which is essentially a polarization based on disliking the other side immensely, right, and distrusting the other side, is a polarization that really sort of grinds our government to a halt. Now, having said that, I think it's much more natural for our partisanship to be aligned with all of these things. But what needs to happen is that our leaders need to not try to take advantage of this massive cleavage in the way that they have, right? There has to be a willingness on the part of our leaders to sometimes trust the other side, trust their colleagues across the aisle, and when they do that, they show the rest of us that can be done. When they discuss issues, they should try as hard as they can to not question the motives of their political opponents, right? They can question the judgment of their political opponents. They can question the opinions of their political opponents, but don't question the motives. Everything doesn't have to be about inspiring anger and fear, right? We can do politics without doing that. And certainly politicians shouldn't delve into one thing that I study, which is dehumanizing language. That is language where you literally sort of rob opponents of human characteristics. And we as humans tend to think of human characteristics as good. I don't know that that may be sort of generous of us, but we tend to see human characteristics as good. And by robbing others of those characteristics, especially among leaders, what happens is people further down the rank and file Democrats and Republicans, as my research has shown, start doing that at a pretty alarming rate, right? I find something like 80% of voters are willing to say that their side is more evolved than the other side. And the gaps are pretty huge. It's not just small gaps typically. So, it's troubling. And we know that elite rhetoric leads to dehumanization among the masses, right? And we know that dehumanization among the masses can lead to things like violence, political violence. And we want to avoid that. Now, I don't think we're on the cusp of political violence, although I do think that there are scenarios that, of this election turning out where one side or the other feels like it's being stolen from them, where you could see relatively widespread political violence. but I do think we're seeing some troubling trends, right? And dehumanization is one of those. We have been releasing the results over the last few days, and a tremendous number of people are fearful and will say they will be angry. A lot of people are concerned about the prospect for election violence. There's been a lot of money spent. One interesting finding is there's been a lot of money spent on this campaign, about $6 billion it seems, and we asked people when they made up their minds, and a massive number of people, like 60-something%, said that they made up their minds when Donald Trump was elected, right? That's like 70% of Biden voters. So a lot of Biden voters had decided when Donald Trump was elected. Like 85% made up their minds during the first 2 years of the Trump presidency, right? And another 10% made up their minds in a few months ago. So really, when this election has been sort of at its peak, when this campaign has been at its peak, and when a lot of this $6 billion has been spent, at best 5% of voters were really still without their minds made up. So it's kind of an interesting phenomenon in a lot of ways. You know, we look at things that just happened, the debates, the pandemic, which isn't that new, but still most voters made up their minds. The vast majority, in fact, of voters made up their minds, if you believe what they tell us, made up their minds before the novel coronavirus jumped species. So, as much as everything has changed this year, one thing that doesn't seem to have changed much is the minds of voters during the course of this campaign.
One thing we see from the UMass poll is that voters have made their minds up very early, and there are very few undecided voters. In fact, 1% of people at this point, the day before the election, are undecided. And that's different from 4 years ago, when people really weren't sure going into the election booth who they were going to vote for. So voters made up their mind as soon as Trump was elected, whether they were going to support him or not. And then over the next year, they were even firmer. And part of this is because our country is polarized even more into two political parties. So people really feel loyal to one party, and they have what we call an affective feeling towards the other party. They really dislike what the other party stands for, and they see politics through the prism of their own party. So that's what's going on. High polarization, and picking candidates really early before things. Now, the other thing I was going to say that I would point out to students is this is going to be an extraordinarily high turnout, probably the biggest turnout in 100 years. It's quite amazing. And, it wasn't too long ago we were having turnouts of 50%. We're going to see turnouts in excess of 65%, which is a lot for Americans. And the reason is it's a high stakes election for many people. There's a lot of fear. This goes back to my first point. There's a lot of fear of the other side and what they might do. People feel personally very loyal. They're concerned that the other party is too extreme or too hurtful of the country. So that drives people to the election booth. So that's the good thing, is it, polarization gets people to see the stakes as high, but the bad thing is they see the stakes as high and we have polarized world. I guess the last thing I would say about this, and this has to do with a lot of my research, this election is going to be $14 billion, they estimate. Tons of money in this election. Most people are focused on the presidential election. And the truth is, money in the presidential election doesn't matter that much in terms of the outcome, because the news, the press, people like yourself cover the presidential election so much that they're already getting a lot of attention. And it can help in certain swing districts to reach a few more voters, but it's really not a big impact. Where the money makes a difference is in congressional races, where people aren't paying as much attention. And that's where a lot of this money is going, especially in some of those Senate races that could change the balance of power. So I guess my point in my research is you know, yeah, money matters, but sometimes not as much as people think. But just like turnout, people think this is a hugely high stakes election. So people are giving a lot of money because they want to make sure they win, and a lot of small donors and a lot of big donors, both. So it's driving huge numbers in money. That's a really good question. I think that both parties, regardless of who wins, are going to have some growing pains. I think if the Republicans lose, there's going to be a lot of finger pointing about who's to blame. And some people are going to say, well, the Trump way, the nationalist way, the being bad to immigrants way wasn't the way to go. And they'll try to take back the party to more traditional Republicanism. I don't think that's going to change too much because I think a lot of people in the Republican Party are set in a kind of Trumpian way. So the Republican Party is going to face a lot of trouble electorally over the next 4 to 8 years. And they're not going to change very much for that time because the people are not going to change their minds that much who are living. Maybe when they die out, it'll change. The Democrats are going to, if they, let's say they take back government, let's say they win the Senate and the presidency, there's going to be a battle for the soul of the party between the kind of progressives more on the left side who want radical change and the moderates who, many of whom might be winning in this election in the Senate. So, you know, if President Biden becomes, if he's the president, if Biden's the president, he's going to have to deal with these divisions. It's going to be interesting to see how they play out, especially in the Senate, because the Senate, it's going to be tough for some senators from purple or states that even lean red from being too radical, because then they'll get voted out, and they'll be afraid of that. Yes, the parties have been moving apart for the last 3 or 4 decades, and there's a lot of reasons for that. One of the reasons is because the people who are most passionate, the people who give money, the people who campaign, the people who call up politicians tend to be more very left or very right, and they have strong reasons for supporting those positions. Most voters are more in the middle, and they don't pay attention to politics as much. And so politicians pay more attention to those kind of active extreme voters, because these are the people who provide the resources to win. These are the people who vote for them in primaries. These are the people who constantly are talking to them. So that's not going to change for a long time. The party is going to be polarized, regrettably, because in our American system, it works better if there's some bit of bipartisanship. We're seeing less of that. Some things will be passed in bipartisan, but the really hot button issues, it's hard to get any bipartisanship. So we're in for polarized politics for at least another decade. One thing I'd say is definitely vote. I mean, students represent the lowest proportion. They vote at the lowest rates almost of any Americans. Even though a lot of UMass students are passionate, I know there's going to be high turnout among UMass students. However, nationally, the youth vote is always underrepresented for a lot of reasons. Sometimes they're moving around. Other times they're not really intensely partisan yet. They haven't really developed loyalty. So it's like, so there's a lot of reasons. So I encourage students to really be engaged, pay attention, get involved where you can, draw in other people, and listen to other sides. Don't write off other people. We're in a situation where we have this kind of dislike of the other side. Even if you disagree with the other side's policies, at least open your mind to what they're saying. Denigrating people is not going to help our nation's politics. So as you get more engaged, really figure out ways you can have common ground. Fight for your principles, but where you can really listen to the other side. Don't assume your side is always right. That's what I would encourage students to think.